Hello and welcome to A Critical Dragon, where I talk about narrative in film, television, and in books. And just in case you're wondering, using the little avatar today because migraines are bad and I look absolutely terrible. But I wanted to record this video to talk a little bit about transparent prose because I think when we discuss it, there are a number of misconceptions, misapprehensions, misunderstandings about what we mean by it, because we frequently conflate transparent prose, which is a very particular writing style, very popular writing style, with considerations of content. And like all matters of narrative, style, content, all of these different elements do work together in the best circumstances. Style supports content, content supports style. All of the different narrative elements like character, setting, scene, world building, word choice, diction, pacing, all of these things come together to support the narrative. But today, I just want to talk a little bit about transparent prose. And before I get into this, the first thing that I want to make very, very clear, to do well, transparent prose is difficult, just as difficult as any other style. Any style, to do it well, requires time and effort and skill. There is no style that is easy. Some styles come more naturally to authors, to certain authors. But to do any style consistently and well requires skill and practice. And there's a very famous quotation. I would have written a shorter letter, but I did not have the time. I think it was Blaise Pascal. And this goes to the heart of talking about a lot of stuff like this. In order to do it well, it needs to be crafted very, very specifically. And so, what I wanted to talk about today is not a condemnation or criticism of the style. It may not be my personal preference a lot of the time. And yet, there are a lot of different narratives that are constructed in transparent prose that I love. But we all have preferences. And I prefer narratives that have a much stronger element of authorial voice. But that does not mean that I don't respect and can't enjoy well written, transparent prose. But let's talk a little bit about some of the ways that we discuss transparent prose, some of the common elements that people mention. And the first is that it is colorless, that it is transparent, that it is invisible. Sometimes we hear people say it doesn't get in the way of the story. And another element that gets pointed out is, well, it doesn't have those poetic devices. It doesn't have any of that fancy stuff in it. It's simple, it's plain, it's straightforward, it's easy to read, it's uncomplicated. It just gets across the bare necessities, the constituent elements that are needed by the reader. And I'm going to go through each of those points in a second, but I want to bring up something as a point of comparison. Anyone who has taken a course or read up about business writing and business communication and journalism will be familiar with what is now called the 7 C's of communication. Be clear, be concise, be concrete, be correct, be coherent, be complete, and be courteous. And while not a perfect fit, there's a significant level of overlap between the sort of the 7 C's guiding principle of business writing and what is happening with transparent prose. Because let's take that first point. It's colorless, it's transparent, it's invisible, it doesn't call attention to itself. What is actually being discussed here is that the reader assumes that the writing is neutral, that the writing is unremarkable. And one of the ways that this is conceived is it appears normal. And the vast majority of writing that we consume is journalistic or business oriented. That's guided by those seven C's of business writing. That's what our base norm is for writing: non-fiction, journalism, articles and things that we read online that are written in a what we assume is a natural register. But that style is just as artificial as any other style because it's putting the words on the page in a specific order to elicit a certain response from a reader and convey certain information. That it is just as artificial in that sense as any other style. But it's one that we are far more familiar with, and therefore something written in that style can have the appearance of being normal, of being neutral. Because when you think about it, calling it transparent or invisible or colorless or any of those sorts of things, this is all metaphor, this is all analogy, because it is not physically transparent. It is still the letters on the page. What we're talking about is a reduction in elements with which we are unfamiliar, or elements which stand out as unusual, or elements that seem to be more about the art of writing than the transmission of information. But fiction as a thing is not business writing. It is not reportage. It is not journalism. They have a different audience. They have a different intention. They are trying to communicate something differently in a different way with specific criteria. Literature, on the other hand, is to be enjoyed. And again, when it comes down to it, what you enjoy, what I enjoy, these are all personal preferences, not evaluative judgments about what is good, but about what we enjoy. And in matters of taste and preference, the customer is always right. So it is absolutely fine to enjoy this style, but that doesn't mean that the style is invisible. And it doesn't mean that the style is a non style. It is a stylistic choice and it isn't invisible because word choice is incredibly important in journalism and in business writing and in writing transparent prose. The next point that I sort of had brought up is this comment that it doesn't get in the way of the story. Personally, I dislike this. And the reason I dislike this, well, actually, there's two. The first is the framing of that comment. It doesn't get in the way of the story, is overemphasizing story as an element of narrative. Narrative, be it film, television, the written word, is made up of multiple elements. Story is just one part of it. And I know this is not a precise term that people, it doesn't get in the way of the story. What we generally mean by something like this is it doesn't take me out of the reading, that I can be more immersed when I am comfortable with the level it is written at and the style in which it is written. And therefore, things aren't becoming jarring and kicking me out of the reading. But style can support that focalization of description through character can be an incredible way to make something more immersive and to bring you closer into that character's perspective. And it is an incredibly powerful tool when it is done well. And again, like so many of these things, when it is done well is usually the thing that we add to make it positive. When it's done badly, of course it stands out. Anything when done badly stands out. The second element about this that it doesn't get in the way of the story is that it ignores how language choice is so incredibly important in evoking all of those elements of story and plot and character. Word choice is incredibly important. And yet, there seems to be, because of that sort of slant toward a journalistic just the facts, ma'am kind of attitude, that, well, one word is as good as another. And anyone who has studied literature knows the power of particular word choice and how it can reframe and reshape things. And I'll give an example of that later. So another point raised is they don't use those fancy, it doesn't use that fancy poetic devices or anything like that. So using similes and metaphors and assonance and alliteration and syncopation and paying attention to the rhythm of sentences and the structure of sentences, when that can't be further from the truth. Metaphors and similes are rife in transparent prose, but a particular type of them, that they have to fit with the tongue, the register, the diction, the structures. They have to fit within that. But metaphors and symbolism and abstract thought, we can find a lot of that in transparent prose. It's simple, it's plain, and it's straightforward. And that gets to the heart of this being a neutral style, or the perception of it being a neutral style. Because what we're actually sort of pointing out here is that usually the diction level is a lot lower. It makes the writing more accessible and less reliant on pre-existing knowledge of different styles and broader vocabularies. It is a simpler range to be inhabited, or a lower range of literacy is necessary for the understanding of what is happening on the page. And that ties into, obviously, easy to read. By easy to read, sometimes people mean skimmable. You can read it faster because the language is simpler, the structures are simpler, therefore you can move through it very, very quickly. And that can be a benefit for a particular style of narrative. But at the same time, part of reading is the enjoyment of reading. So something that makes it faster, something that makes it easier to speed through, is actually, from one particular perspective, a negative. Because if you can go through it very, very quickly, you're not spending time on it. You're not appreciating the words on the page. You're literally just, I want to find out what happens next. And it reduces our awareness of, or appreciation of, how the story is being told. And I know not everyone enjoys that. Again, absolutely fine not to enjoy it. But sometimes the level of difficulty with reading has less to do with what is on the page and how well trained and experienced we are as readers. Because if you think this style is easy to read, and part of that is our familiarity with it, because this style is in business writing, in business communication, in journalism. It's something we are used to reading all the time. All those non-fiction books, or sorry, non-fiction books. So the textbooks we read at school, all of those handouts, all of that is written in this style, which is one of the reasons why we're so familiar with it and why it appears easy to read. And yet, the more varied our reading, the more other styles become equally easy to read. Here's one that I vehemently disagree with. It's uncomplicated. There can be an appearance of simplicity, but just like Pascal said, I would have written a shorter letter, but I did not have the time. The appearance of it being uncomplicated, the appearance of it being simple, is usually due to the skill of the writer to go through and refine what they have written to such an point to create that impression. But that can be incredibly difficult to do, particularly to do well. And the last thing is just the bare necessities, just the facts, just what the reader needs. And again, this leans into a certain style of storytelling. It leans into a certain set of expectations that some of us have when we read certain types of narratives, that it is just what is necessary. But when you think about it, not all narratives are like that, because we can talk about it structurally in terms of satellites, in terms of kernels. Because if we talk about what is strictly necessary for the narrative, not just the story, not just the plot, but what is necessary for the narrative, then what is necessary for the narrative can be scenes of character description. Sorry, I got interrupted by two cat editors deciding to help me with the video. What I was talking about there was when we talk about what is necessary for a narrative, sometimes those are slower sequences where nothing happens, where character is being developed, where scene or setting are being developed, and they add to a sense of atmosphere or a sense of tone, or are trying to foreshadow elements that they are not strictly necessary, in the sense of, if you remove them, could the story still happen? Could the events still unfold and be cohesive? Yes. So therefore, they are not strictly necessary. They are flavor, they are style, they are tone, and they add and can add, particularly when done well, can add to the sense of immersion. And sometimes the recitation of facts, the recitation of information can be very immersion breaking, because it's almost as if you're just reading a summary, a bland description. And that isn't usually why people try to engage with fiction for pleasure reading. So things like it just gives you the bare necessities. That concision, it's not about necessarily, well, at least in my opinion, the bare necessities. It's about supplying the reader with all that is necessary to create the effect and impression that the author wishes to convey, not just give you the shortest possible span from A to B to C to D in a plot-centric narrative. But let's return to this idea that it avoids the poetic or those sort of artistic devices. One of the authors who has very publicly spoken about their desire to use transparent prose, and whose fans talk about his writing in terms of he is a great example of transparent prose. I'm going to put a couple of examples up here on the screen from Brandon Sanderson's The Way of Kings. The eyes were deep red spots on the arrowhead face, as if created by a fire burning deep within the stone. There, in Jezreel's eyes, Callac saw anguish and grief, perhaps even cowardice. This was a man hanging from a cliff by a thread. He seemed so cold, like a shadow caused by heat and light falling on someone honorable and true, casting this black imitation behind. So let's go back to high school English and talking about metaphors and similes, those poetic devices that apparently transparent prose doesn't have. And this is why, when we talk about it, one of the things to always bear in mind, people tend to think in simplistic binaries. It is transparent or it is opaque. It is simple or it is complicated. That all that exists are these dyadic pairs, these binaries, these endpoints. But what we actually have is a spectrum that it can run from absolutely opaque, obtuse, convoluted language, all the way to stark recitation of fact. And fiction typically falls somewhere in between. And a single book will constantly move backwards and forwards toward these different points and away from these different points. Because every sentence, every paragraph, every scene, every chapter will utilize different elements at different times. And Brandon Sanderson, who has spoken very frequently about his desire to use transparent prose, uses poetic devices, uses imagery, uses abstract notions. Unless, of course, you read that sentence there in Jezreel's eyes, Cailleach saw anguish and grief, perhaps even cowardice. This was a man hanging from a cliff by a thread. Jezreel, in the scene, is not literally hanging from a cliff by a thread. This is a metaphor. This has symbolism attached to it, connotation attached to it, abstract notions attached to it. This is not literal. And I think that easily disproves this point that the prose in transparent prose has to eschew or completely get rid of poetic devices. It doesn't. But what we see with a lot of Sanderson's use is having very simple, straightforward, natural poetic devices that link very strongly to the thing being described. So the eyes were deep red spots on the arrowhead face, as if created by a fire burning deep within the stone. We know that the thunderclast is a stone creature. It has these bright red eyes. And so fire, red and stone glowing, the fire metaphor or the fire simile works. A man hanging from a cliff by a thread. Hanging on by a thread, hanging on by your fingernails, hanging on by the skin of your teeth. All of these are quite natural ways that people speak. It's a bit like using the expression, oh, that car went off like a rocket, meaning quickly. We wouldn't notice it. It doesn't stand out because it feels like a natural way to express something. It is usually linked to the thing that we're talking about. Obviously, initially in the Stormlight archives, referring to something as going off like a rocket might seem a little bit strange, but that's because of the world in which it's sent, the type of narrative that it is, and we wouldn't be expecting it. And so in these three examples, and this is from the prelude of The Way of Kings, this isn't just the bare necessities. This isn't, or these are using poetic devices. They don't get in the way of the story. They add to it. But these are color. These are flavor. These are not just the bare necessities of what the reader needs to know. This is an artistic way to express it. And this is in the style of writing that the author and a large proportion of his fan base point to as transparent prose. And so that can immediately sort of take it off the list because, yes, these things get included because it's fiction. It's not scientific report writing or business writing. And again, some people think that word choice is not important. That with transparent prose, oh, it's just using normal words, the how people would normally speak. It's not doing anything clever with words. That it's just the word that naturally comes to mind. authors, because of their a lot of their reading, their training, the things that they're interested in, the words that naturally come to their mind are not necessarily the same as the ones that naturally come to our mind. But again, looking at the Way of Kings, there are two interesting word choices here that I wanted to talk about. So put them up on screen. Each was a masterly work of art, flowing in design, inscribed with glyphs and patterns. So, why masterly? The common way in the modern day to describe something that was created by a master craftsman or craftsperson, we would typically say masterful. It was a masterful work of art. We would typically say that in the modern day. And the thing is, in the past, we would be wrong to say that. Because masterful and masterly, while they are currently used synonymously, that they mean the same thing. Masterful actually meant imperious, the sense of someone being your master, whereas masterly meant created by someone who was a master. So masterful actually in this sense would be the more common way to refer to a work of art. It was a masterful meal. It was a masterful painting. We don't typically say masterly, even though masterly is the correct word. So in this instance, Sanderson uses masterly, which is the correct word, even though masterful would be the more common word, but its original meaning would be, well, would actually fit with part of what is being described, because it's about these swords, and therefore the imperious implication of force actually fits very well. But in the sense being used here of a work of art that is beautiful and amazing, masterful wouldn't mean that. And so he uses the correct word, even though masterful would be the more common one. So let's look at this other one. Less frequently, he passed cracked, oddly shaped hollows where thunderclaps had ripped themselves free of the stone to join the fray. Ripped is obviously a violent, emotive word that is being used here because it gives you a sense of how these monstrous creatures had risen up from the stone, the violence associated with that. But that is a colorful phrase that is adding color to it. You could use a far more neutral term than ripped. Had emerged from is more neutral than ripped, but it is less expressive, it is less colorful. It doesn't get across the sense of these things. And then the word fray, to join the fight, would be the common neutral way. But fray is an older word, an archaism. And yes, it's still used in certain idioms, but it is a less common word. And it is archaic. It gives you a sense of the fantasy style of this writing, because even though it is ostensibly transparent prose, Sanderson is still careful with his word choice, is still trying to evoke a sense of the fantastic. So let's have a look at George Orwell's 1984. This is one, again, written in transparent prose. The hallway smelt of boiled cabbage and old rag mats. At one end of it, a colored poster, too large for indoor display, had been tacked to the wall. It depicted simply an enormous face, more than a meter wide. The face of a man of about 45 with a heavy black moustache and ruggedly handsome features. Winston made for the stairs. There was no use trying to lift. I don't need to go through all of this. You can see that this is written in a journalistic style. It is written in a straightforward style. And yet, in that opening sentence, the hallway smelt of boiled cabbage and old rag mats, still evoking a sense of smell. And then a giant colored poster, but it's been tacked to the wall. All of these details, these are technically extraneous details. This is not necessary for plot, it's not necessary for character, but it is necessary for the creation of how this place feels, what this world is like to live in. And by evoking the senses, by evoking these different images, it gets a lot of that across. But this is written in clear, unambiguous language. It's not complicated, but it's doing it very, very well. And another thing to notice about this is, again, Orwell was writing something that was intended to be this urbanized proletariat, the working plebe. This was meant to be from the point of view of the common person, of the normal person. And therefore, this style immediately supports that notion when you're writing a story about the every person experience. And from that perspective, about the norm of this new world, then choosing a style that supports that makes sense. So it's not just that this is written in transparent prose, it's that the style is actually supporting the type of narrative, the type of character, the type of world. It's thinking about the style in conjunction with as a way to support the story, add to the story. And just as in those Sanderson examples, those elements of color, and style, and where the words weren't normal, they didn't detract from what Sanderson was doing. They were adding to the sense of the fantastic. Just as here, using very straightforward, plain, um, uncomplicated prose, Orwell establishes a base norm, establishes this common point of view, and that supports the style of narrative that he was creating. But one of the most famous sort of examples of transparent prose, one of the reasons why it had such a has had such a strong impact in American writing in particular, and since then been disseminated further, was looking at Hemingway. And I wanted to talk a bit about Hemingway because Hemingway is a great example of this transparent prose style, but show how complicated it is. Hemingway initially trained as a journalist. So column inches were limited. Therefore, every word had to count. Newspapers were read by everyone in the street. Therefore, they had to be written in a register, allowing them to communicate with their readership. And you couldn't expect readers to have a vast background in literature and have very high elements of literacy. You were trying to communicate with everyone. So accessibility and concision, very, very important. Newspapers were trying to get across the important information in the day while people were on their commute or while they were doing other things. Newspapers were being read in a different way to how one assumes readers read novels. And therefore, the communication of the information was key. And so Hemingway took a lot of this background and applied it to his writing. But he combined it with what he called the iceberg, the narrative iceberg, the story iceberg, the iceberg storytelling method, where you can remove very important aspects and basically imply them, because by removing them and implying them, the reader can feel them. They can feel the presence of them. That you sketch out with your words the tip of the iceberg, but the majority of the story, the majority of the feeling, the majority of what you're communicating is not visible on the page. It is implied. And when you think back to those points being made about transparent prose, this is going into a huge element of implication and symbolism and complication in how things are written. So there is an apparent simplicity, an apparent neatness and straightforwardness. But what is lying beneath it is hugely complex. And this is a highly technical way of writing, a difficult way of writing. It is difficult to do what Hemingway did. And so if we just have a quick look at a section from The Old Man and the Sea, he remembered the time he had hooked one of the pair of marlin. The male fish always let the female fish feed first, and the hooked fish, the female, made a wild, panic stricken, despairing fight that soon exhausted her. And all the time, the male had stayed with her, crossing the line and circling with her on the surface. Now, unlike a lot of Sanderson's writing, Sanderson typically uses one, two, and at most three clauses per sentence. Typically, there are exceptions, but Sanderson tries to use very short sentences, uncomplicated sentences. Hemingway doesn't necessarily do that. And here we have the male fish always let the female fish feed first, and the hooked fish, the female, made a wild and panic stricken, despairing fight that soon exhausted her, and all the time the male had stayed with her, crossing the line and circling with her on the surface. That seems like a long, unwieldy sentence. And yet we start with this is how it starts. The male fish lets the female fish feed, the female fish becomes hooked, and this male fish keeps circling round and round, all while the female fish is fighting. This is all happening in almost one moment. It's using the sentence to bracket the encapsulation of this one image that is going to have symbolic meaning. But when we look through Hemingway's writing, he had stayed so close that the old man was afraid he would cut the line with his tail, which was sharp as a scythe and almost of that size and shape. So again, using using a simile, but it is straightforward. It is an easy to understand one. When the old man had gaffed and clubbed her, holding the rapier bill with its sandpaper edge and clubbing her across the top of the head. So rapier bill, sandpaper edge, clubbing. Look at the use of language. This is very, very particular. This is specific. So it's using weapon imagery, violent imagery, but relating it in a very simple, straightforward act, but getting across the barbarity of it, the violence of it, the tactile sense of it. And none of the language is complicated, but what is being conveyed, what is being implied, what is being built up can be complicated. And so all of this is to say, going through this, when we talk about transparent prose, when we talk about this particular style, I think it is important to remember it is a stylistic choice, just like any other style. No better, no worse than any other stylistic choice. And it will always contain elements of these poetic devices because it's fiction, it's not reportage, it's not journalism. And even journalism uses poetic devices because they are incredibly effective ways of conveying things. And just because something is in transparent prose, it doesn't mean that it moves to translucent at some point, that it starts using things with color, because voice and diction and word choice, all of these things can add to immersion. And so holding these simplistic absolute definitions actually harms our understanding of what the thing is, harms our understanding of how it is being employed, and harms our understanding of the literature itself. It leads us to these conclusions in entirely the wrong direction, thinking that transparent prose doesn't use poetic devices. Clearly, it does. Newspapers do, and they are written in transparent prose. It's not that no poetic devices are used, but once we acknowledge that, yes, they are used, we can actually focus on the type, the style, how they are integrated, because that is usually a far more interesting question than the denial that they exist when they clearly do. When we talk about transparent prose being uncomplicated, we are denying the artistry that good transparent prose actually employs. Transparent prose appears uncomplicated, but actually it is just as technical. When done well, it is just as technical as any other style when it is done well. And this is an artistic choice. It can impact the narrative. It can impact how we perceive the world, because all of these things are being created on the page for us. And so this entire video is basically trying to think about transparent prose as another style and think about it in those terms. Think about the things that we value or even criticize in other styles, and think about how those actually appear in transparent prose, but the way that they appear or the way that they are integrated is different. But to deny their existence simply because it's transparent is both a misrepresentation of this style of writing, and usually it's a misrepresentation of the author and what they have created. But anyway, thank you very much for watching. Thank you for your continued support, and I will see you in the next one.